you, Professor Easterbrook. Mike Jungbauer is a native Minnesotan. He currently serves in his second term as a Minnesota State Senator, where he sits on an Energy and Utility Committee. His background is in biochemistry, and when he's not helping to shape Minnesota public policy, he works on water and wastewater treatment issues. Please join me in welcoming State Senator Mike Jungbauer.
Well, I think it's clear that elected officials need to know something about global warming or the lack thereof. And Don was really clear in understanding, what are the implications and what do we need to know? And as policy people, what are the implications of spending all this money on one thing? So when I got interested in global warming, was back in 2003. And really people started telling me what was in policy papers had nothing to do with the actual science. And so I started talking to my fellow legislators, and nobody really understood anything about what was going on. So I said, okay, let's start from the beginning. Let's understand, let's all try to learn together in Minnesota. So I started out with the Earth's energy balance. So we've got some of these little, and I think a lot of different versions of energy balance, and actually Roy's sitting in the front. I kind of like his, it's very simple. I got to see Roy a couple weeks ago in Minneapolis. I like to go around and listen to people talk on the subject, and generally we don't see a whole lot of legislators out there getting educated on things. So I try to go out there, and last year I did 36 different presentations around Minnesota to local elected officials, city councils, school boards, and just trying to get them to understand. And the way I present it is I tell people, I don't care what your passion is, I don't care what side of the issue you're on, but don't come up and tell me something's happening without knowing some of the facts and being able to enter into a discussion and sit down and discuss with me what is going on with the Earth's energy balance. How is it working? How do some of these issues work? So that's where you got to kind of start, as a basic understanding of energy coming in, energy going out. We do, even as legislators, need to understand a little bit about positive and negative feedback. This is a simple diagram on positive feedback, and the one key that legislators don't understand, and it was repeated over and over here by presenters, is what the ICCC assumes is always positive feedbacks that would give you an increase in temperature rise. So we need to, as legislators, even understand the basic minimum of what's the difference between the positive or the negative feedback. And as I've listened at the conference and conferences I've gone to, my conclusion is, and I try to keep it in simple terms, is everything that we have in hard data is telling us we have a negative feedback, which in simple terms for policymakers is the effect is going to be minimal. The effect is going to be minimal. I always like to say, know your competitors and their message. So we have Susan Solomon. In the middle here, we have Will Steger. Will Steger is from Minnesota, Arctic explorer. And when I go to see Will Steger present his version of global warming, one of the first things he shows people is a nice picture of a polar bear, and he just has the whole audience in the palm of his hand, and he says, this polar bear died of global warming. And my question always to Will is, where's the autopsy? Polar bears get old, and this polar bear he shows looks kind of old. And, I'd really like to see the autopsy. Maybe I'm one of those deniers, and, hey, but show me the statistics. Show me the science. James Hansen, he's an interesting character. I got to sit down for lunch with him at a convention in southern Minnesota. He was up, and Stephen Chu as well. Interesting about these gentlemen, in listening to their presentations, when they're not in front of their friends, they act totally different. Now, I think that's troubling when you're in the political arena, and I try to always have the same face on no matter where I am. If I'm in the middle of a bunch of people that think global warming is happening, you will hear the same message out of me as if I think I'm in the middle of people that agree with me. And that is the key to getting that message across. You can't go back and forth. So it was interesting, both Stephen Chu and James Hansen said we will never get away from fossil fuels, and we have 200 to 400 years supply of coal. We need to use that. So they admitted in a great sized group of people that was part of where we had to go with it. We simply had to clean things up. And yet, when you come to the Minnesota legislature, and I sat alongside of my fellow legislators in that convention, and it was like they closed their ears and said, no, 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 we want to get rid of coal. We want to get rid of fossil fuels. The last one on the bottom is one of my favorites, and you wouldn't know him. It was Paul Douglas from Channel 4 News in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. And Paul Douglas would always go out and do these community meetings and tell people, the evils of global warming and anthropogenic CO2 emissions. And he would go out there in front of me, and I would kind of follow him, or vice versa. I would go do a presentation in a community, and Paul would follow me. And I would hold up books and actually hand out books at different presentations and talk about the science. And it was interesting because Paul found out what I was doing, and he put the books, one of them was Unstoppable Global Warming Every 1,500 Years. He would put that right up on his presentation and say to everybody, this book has no science in it. And people follow that. They believed what he said, and then when I go out and do a presentation, I would open up the book and say, listen, there's over 200 published, peer-reviewed scientific research projects cited in this book. And it's, you got to know what your message is, that your competitors, so to speak, in terms of legislation, these are our competitors. They are the people that are out there messaging, and we need to know what they say, so you need to get out there. It was interesting, Susan Solomon's latest thing from NOAA, I read the press release, and I went out, and our legislative assistants, we have a good group of legislative assistants, so I got them together and I said, I read this press release, I want to tell you guys, here's my impression of what she's going to say in her research. And you almost know exactly what the research is going to say based on their press release. We went and we couldn't find the research online, so as a legislator, we have a few privileges. So we called up NOAA. Within 10 minutes, we had a copy of that research paper. And we were rolling over in the aisles laughing because it's so easy to predict what their research is going to say just on their press releases and how they have to pervert the evidence in order to come to their conclusion. So it's kind of fun. Summary for policymakers. When you read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change summary, that was one of the first things. In 2003, a friend of mine called me and said, Mike, I know you're into science. I know you like that biochemistry stuff. And actually in 2003, I thought man was causing global warming. I work in the bioremediation field. I work with wastewater, water supplies. So I believe that whatever man does to the environment, we ought to clean up, and science is there. In fact, we can clean up most things exponentially cheaper than we used to. We understand some things about what we're doing. So I thought, well, if we're doing this, we ought to move ahead with due diligence. And what I found is when I read this, I thought, oh my gosh, we're really, we're doing terrible damage to the earth. And he said, well, read the rest of the science. So we pulled the rest of the science down, and it was unbelievable. There was this huge disconnect between what the research was saying and what the summary for policymakers was saying. And the key there is you got to understand it is people that have a specific political agenda that are writing these summaries. And that is what you need to help legislators and elected officials get over. Really what this summary for policymakers is just a nice, unique way of piling up poop in a way that looks really good. So I thought this was a great picture to show. We're drying out some dung, and I really feel like the policymakers' summary was exactly that, a great way to stack the BS. The observed and predicted temperature change. When you get into the IPCC reports and we get into climate models, and you can see every one of the actual model temperature changes does not match the actual observed trend. And that's what policymakers need to understand. Every prediction, this gets into the positive feedback. The positive feedback talks about a greater increase in temperature, and so we don't need to know the details. We don't all need to go back to school, although I went back to school and took chemistry of the troposphere and a few other classes to understand some of these things, but we need to understand reality versus what shows up in these research. Some of the possibilities for warming. The urban heat island effect. We all know that's real. Urban heat island, it does absorb heat, it does re-release it. Smokestacks was an interesting one. NOVA did an interesting 1-hour special on whether or not putting something at a higher temperature into the atmosphere could cause an increase in temperature. And actually their conclusion, to keep it simple, go watch the NOVA show on PBS, was that would account for 50% of the increase in observed temperature. Although we know it's much different, but again, people coming out with ideas to think about. Bad temperature measurements. There was great presentations on that if you understand where our temperature sensors are. It's lunacy to think we're getting accurate measurements. And again, this is the kind of thing that really goes over with the public and policymakers. They need to see something visually. They're not just going to listen to you. So you have to be able to message. We do have to have sound bites. But in this case, a picture's worth 1,000 words. A legislator gets that there is no way we can expect accurate temperature measurements from that type of a situation. Man's hockey stick. I can't believe how many elected people still don't know this exists or that it was debunked. I do keep in my office, just so you know, is I have 10 copies of Al Gore's movie Inconvenient Truth. However, when you check it out of my office, you can't see the Inconvenient Truth without taking at least 2 other DVDs, and I say, you watch this, but then watch the 2 other DVDs, and I want you to tell me when you're done what you thought. And it is extremely funny when you can put a couple other DVDs with, and Heartland's really good at providing the right kind of documentation. People just do understand how foolish Al Gore is when you're done. The Vostok Ice Core, this is interesting because you can go back, and again, it creates the fact that we've been there before, and yet we've had presenters here that will tell you there's a lot of inaccurate information in there. But as far as a policymaker, just to go back and say the temperature's been there before, the CO2's been there before, we're just creating the whole documentation that this is nothing new, we're going through some cycles, and we'll get through it. This is some more information that talks about El Nino, La Nina. People need to understand just another thing, a little bit about it and how its effects are in terms of warming and cooling. The PDO is fun to try to understand because people are starting to banty these terms around. And so as you know, some legislators do it, we've got to get everybody on the same page to say at least we know what these terms are and their potential for warming or cooling. The ocean conveyor belt. We had a really neat discussion in the last hour about the ocean conveyor belt, how it moves different things through the oceans, but how that affects climate overall and the temperature, and how things that move between Pacific Decadal Oscillation or the ocean conveyor belt. These are things that all play in, and yet there's so many policymakers out there that don't even understand how complex the whole Earth is, the biosphere, and how many things play into that. And that's part of the problem. When you have this big complex thing, to break it down and bring it to legislators. We kind of talked about that. If you look at the other side's message, it's all CO2, CO2, CO2. People are hammered with it, so the first thing they think about is every time a hurricane comes, oh, it's CO2. Every time the temperature changes, it's CO2. In Minnesota, when we're freezing our rears off this winter and extremely cold, they're saying, well, oh, now, you know, climate change can cause global cooling. They change the theory all the time, and even getting back to the basic theory, when I studied what Arrhenius did, I thought, well, Al Gore was wrong, because when he came out with the theory of carbon input, he said warm times were good times. So Al Gore got it all wrong. Arrhenius wanted it to be warm and was trying to figure out a way to warm it up as opposed to cooling it down, and so we ought to go with that. In fact, I wanted to mandate that there was global warming within the metropolitan area. I didn't think that bill would go very far, but you know, I like to do a lot of stuff outside, and I thought it was good for tourism, so people are thinking all wrong. If we had global warming, it would be a positive thing. Pacific Decadal Oscillations, again, to understand that we have this cyclical nature. People need to understand what's going on and at least understand the terminologies so we can get into the debate. Without a basic understanding of what's going on and all these different cycles that are working together, we're not even at the table for the debate, and that's very troublesome. Misleading the Public. This was a book that goes out to, I think it's called Scholastic Booksellers, the stuff that goes out to your kids at school. And a lot of school kids buy these books, and what they actually did was they reversed the graph, the CO2 and the temperature part of the graph. They intentionally mislabeled it so they could show kids that CO2 drives temperature, when anybody that's read anything about the whole discussion understands that CO2 always lags behind temperature. So intentionally they're indoctrinating our children and selling this stuff to our kids. And the kids, you know, they want to know. And we want to know. I haven't met people that want to intentionally harm the earth. So here we are indoctrinating the kids by intentionally mislabeling things. This is always my fun one. I love this right in the IPCC report because people always say, oh, Greenland's going to melt. Well, when you look at this and you get to the bottom of there and it talks about whether you use the baseline of 2005 or 1999, doesn't matter to me. But if you look at it and you got year 0, volume 100%, year 270, we have 80%. So when I'm out in public, I look at people and I say, think about that. How many people think their house is going to last 270 years? And generally, I don't get a whole lot of people raising their hand in a crowd. And you think about in terms of planning. So before I was a state senator, I was a mayor. And I thought, you know, if somebody told me that my town was going to flood in 270 years, I think I got enough time to make a plan. I really do. And you get out even worse, and, you know, by the way, that 270 years, 80%, they're figuring that might be the 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise. You know, maybe these islands that came up, you know, that 1 to 3 feet might sink that island. But then I thought to myself, you know, how long has that island been around? The island probably was a volcano that came up, and then they seen it out there coming up above the ocean, and they moved out there. Might only been there 50 years. So when you really start studying some of these tribes and different peoples that have been on these islands, they have not been there a long time because the island hasn't been there a long time. So if you got a 270-year plan, you might say, you know, within 270 years, I bet there'll be another volcano and another island created or a higher spot that we can move to. So again, it comes to planning, and policymakers are supposed to be doing long-term planning. So if you're really looking at that 20 feet or 23 feet of sea level rise that Al Gore is going to talk about, wow, look at that. It's predicted in year 1760 from our baseline. 1,760 years. Do you think you have enough time to plan if they're right? And that's if and only if they're right. They're giving you 1,760 years to plan to get to higher ground. My gosh, if it warms up that much, all these glaciers will be gone. We'll have a whole lot of more productive higher ground. But the problem is, and I get these people to stand up in the crowd all the time and go, well, yeah, but look at that. You got all these things down there, these exceptions to the rules down there at the bottom. And it says, yes, that assumes 4 times the CO2 level. 4 times the baseline CO2 level. We're not getting anywhere close to that, and it assumes all these other exponential positive feedbacks on temperature. So people need to understand that, and this is right in the IPCC report. You can't make it up. If you just show them what it says because they didn't look, you'll get there. Well, you know, here's Greenland, and it's going to melt. Oh, wait, it's not doing a very good job. In 1942, a lot of our war guys, you know, they flew their warplanes back. They had to refuel in Greenland. They couldn't make it all the way. And they parked their planes in southern Greenland, and they had an ice storm. And that ice storm went on for about a week and a half, and they decided these gentlemen had been in the war, so they put them back on a ship because they couldn't fly out of there. Well, since 1942, this particular P-38, I'm kind of an aviation buff, was picked up in southern Greenland under 268 feet of ice. So, you know, policymakers aren't the smartest people, but they can get a visual. This was the least amount of ice of that whole fleet. It averaged 300 feet of ice since 1942. Now, didn't we start to produce that CO2 around that time? And wasn't it supposed to be warming, and wasn't the ice supposed to be decreasing? So I don't know how the 300 feet of ice got there in that short period of time, but it got there, and it's troublesome to the global warming alarmists. Even worse, in Antarctica, in 1957, the U.S. Army put up Byrd Station, and right now Byrd Station is shut down because it's beneath 40 to 50 feet of ice, and it's slowly being crushed. But wait, I thought Antarctica was melting as well. Well, you know, you can cherry pick the data and find a space that might be melting, but ought to check the other side of something, because when we're talking global climate change, well, maybe it is changing, but maybe it's much more severe the opposite end in the next city. Well, you know, being the good conservative that I am, I want to always, you know, go out and do my presentations in the right way. So this is me with my new car that I bought last year, and everybody that really wants to protect the environment ought to be driving a hybrid, so I did think nice enough to buy myself a hybrid Camry. So I have to do my presentations, and last year I did 36 presentations around Minnesota and around the country. And the sad part is that when I go, I don't get to go like Al Gore. I don't, get the 150,000 plus and get to get in my nice limousine and fly out, or go out to my personal jet and fly in. And, I'm a little bit smaller budget. I have to take my hybrid car, and I believe in supporting technologies, and I believe we ought to create some new technologies. And no, I didn't actually buy it to save the earth. I bought it because I needed to save gas money, and I got tired of spending all that tax dollars on gas tax. And it's interesting as policymakers, too, as they try to shift socially and get us to do something different, they're always too dumb to think about the ramifications. So for 6 years, I told people, I said, if you get everybody to start driving a hybrid, you forgot one thing. You keep raising the gas tax, and that's linear. It keeps going up linear. And as soon as you change everybody's habits, guess what? It's an exponential decay curve on what you collect on gas tax. And friends, we've seen that last year. People started buying high-mileage vehicles when gas was at $4. We shifted the way people do business, and exponentially, the receipts at the federal level and state level on gas tax went down, and all of a sudden they're trying to figure out some new way to tax us on per-mile basis. Well, when I can't get in traffic and stuff, I do have to take my bicycle, too. And I listened to a presenter yesterday, and he said, well, I'm kind of a leftist. I, drive my hybrid car and ride a bicycle. And I'm thinking, I do that all the time, too. And my office is one office for Senate's in St. Paul. My other office is in downtown Minneapolis. And quite honestly, people don't know how to drive cars down there, so I always carry my bicycle or one of my bicycles on the back of the car. And that's how I do business, is I go back and forth on a bicycle because it's quicker. And I'm getting older. I like to stay in a little better shape. And as a legislator, you eat rotten food, so you got to keep in shape. But it's not because somebody's trying to tell me to save the earth. It makes sense for me, and it makes sense for the markets to create a product that we want to buy, whether it's a bicycle or a hybrid car. I bought the car because it was a good investment and saved a ton of money for me. The market's working. The market's working. All right. Why don't people want to stop? There's too much money in the cure. Whether people created windmills or solar panels, a new photovoltaic, carbon capture and sequestration, carbon cap and trade, ocean fertilizing, biofuels, atmospheric aerosols, the heat pumps, all the green jobs. I'm on the Green Jobs Task Force in Minnesota. We're going to save the world by doing green jobs. And yes, I read Van Jones's Green Collar Economy, and I met with Van Jones last week, and he's got some good ideas. And I don't throw away a book just because it's got some bad pages. I only found 21 pages in the book that were unadulterated BS, and I marked those out, so I point those out to people. But you think about this, and every time somebody comes marching through an Energy and Utilities Committee meeting, there are people that are selling this product, and yet I can't go and advocate for a law that guarantees my product, and that's exactly what's going on here, is this windmills, solar panels, they do not operate in a way that has a positive cash flow in today's market. So people go in and need to make laws and need to make up an excuse to sell their product and have the government mandate their product. And it's crazy the way it goes on. You need to sit through some committees. Wherever you live, go sit through some of these committees and see these people selling their wares and trying to get the government to mandate the use of it. So, facts about the climate. Last 5 years, CO2 went up 11 parts per million, or about 0.5%. Is that enough for alarm? I don't know. CO2 does not drive temperature increases. It's the other way around. Out of 100% of CO2 released in the atmosphere every year, about 3% comes from human activity. We've seen some people argue back and forth the numbers. It's still minutia. Out of 100,000 molecules of atmospheric CO2, 38 of them are CO2. It gets to be ridiculous when you start looking at it, and you got to cut to the chase. How much is man causing? Does it have a positive or negative forcing? Yes, what we do makes a difference, but in order to think that something's wrong with this whole deal, you have to assume that for the next 100 years, we're going to be doing exactly what we've done the last 100 years, and it's not going to happen. We are constantly changing. Everything changes in life. Technology changes. The market brings something new. Don't ever, ever, ever assume tomorrow will look like today, because it will not. Thank you very much.